Please give her a warm welcome. And just so everyone knows, we are recording the meeting today so that people who could not attend can kind of get a view of what happened here. And anybody else who's joining? Okay, I'll let you get started, Andrea, and I'll just keep letting people in as they trickle in if there's some late people.
Can't start yet. You got to do the intro stuff, right?
Hold on just a sec. Yeah. Sorry, I'm pulling up the email.
I think what Jane's talking about is just the general welcome, and just let you know that we're going to handle questions by having you put them in the chat, and after the presentation we'll open it up for questions. So just go ahead and keep yourself muted while we're waiting, or while the presentation is in progress. And also wanted to let you know that the Cal Poly Humboldt Library is now open to the community. So if you haven't had a chance to get up there, we hope that you can make it. Today is Pie Day. So at 3:14, they're serving pie from Bittersweet, or a slice of Humboldt pie. So if you are looking for a little piece of pie, this would be a good day to go up and visit. And plus, there's just some amazing new features to the library. So if you haven't been up there recently, now that it's open, this is a great week because it's spring break too. So lots of parking on campus. So I can't think if there's any other announcements that we need to make. But Jane, you want to go ahead and introduce our guest today?
Sure, but I have one question. Do you have to take your vaccination card when you go up?
You should always bring your vaccination card with you or have it available. And also they do ask that you have your Humboldt ID with you. And if you haven't got your ID, the library is a place to get it. So you can do both at the same time. But yeah, we do ask, you could be asked to show your vaccination card, but I have not been asked yet, just so you know.
That's encouraging. Okay, thank you. And I am delighted today to welcome Andrea Tuttle, who has attended the United Nations, climate negotiations. And she has been struck by the changing dynamics, new players, and voluntary commitments being made there. She serves on the boards of the Pacific Forest Trust and the Save the Redwoods League, which celebrates many wins with conservation and climate policy. She's also the former head of California State Department of Forestry under Governor Gray Davis. Still an active retiree, she's occasionally consulting on forestry and forest issues and how to conserve forests for their intended uses, and focused on understanding the thinking globally side to complement acting locally, which is what we strive to do in this county. Andy, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jane, and it's great to see everybody. Let me start by sharing my screen. Getting set up here. And getting it so I can see. How does that look at your side? Does that work?
Looks good.
Okay, well, I've given several of these over the years, giving climate updates on California climate policy, some of the other UN negotiation sessions in the past. And Jane Woodward is so enthusiastic and persistent in asking me to periodically come back for another update. So many of you have heard me before. Some of you, this is brand new. So I'll try and develop the story so that everybody can get up to speed. When Jen and I originally talked, I had just returned from Glasgow and the UN negotiations. And of course, it was appropriate to have an update. But there's a lot happening domestically as well. And so I'm tagging in some US domestic climate policy in this presentation as in addition. So let's get started. I typically use this slide as an introductory slide just to remind us how thin the layer of atmosphere is. This is where we are spewing all of our pollutants, and The ones that are greenhouse gases serve to trap heat in the atmosphere. That puts more energy in the atmosphere, making the extreme weather events become more extreme. So they're more frequent, they hit harder. We now talk about rain bombs and so on. And so it's because there's more energy in the system that's driving these extreme events. We've set a target of trying to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's embedded in the Paris Agreement, and it was reinforced at Glasgow. If we take a look at a graph of global surface temperature, the vertical is increase in degrees Celsius, and across the bottom is time, and this is going back to 1850. This shows what would happen if we had no accelerated fossil fuel consumption. This is what our climate, what our temperatures would be. But really, our observed temperatures are going up and up as a result of the buildup of greenhouse gases. And you can see that we're getting perilously close to the 1.5 degrees centigrade limit that we've set. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, calls this code red. They're really trying to raise the alarm on this. Every 1/10 of a degree counts. And we need to address every single source of carbon pollution, every possible source, in order to try and keep us at the 1.5, which is where we think that not less, but we can handle the amount of impacts, climate impacts on ecosystems and people. The IPCC has, in this last year, has put together their periodic synthesis report with the science. So they had their climate change report and the physical basis and so on. And the one that just came out just in the last month or so is the report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. As they've said before, it's unequivocal that climate change is a threat to the health of the planet. We are seeing increased heat waves, droughts, and floods, which are exceeding the tolerance thresholds for many species. The weather extremes are occurring simultaneously. It's not just one at a time, it's that so many of them are happening at once. And millions of people around the world are being affected with food insecurity and water and so on. So it's real. I don't think we need to debate that here. In the US, we've now started a new metric called billion-dollar climate disasters. This graph portrays from 1980 to 2021, and you can see the numbers are going up of events, hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, whatever, and heat waves are growing in intensity and number, and they are expensive. I don't know if you remember, but just last June, we had a heat dome over the Pacific Northwest. This was a 1,000-year event. It was not predicted. And 1,400 people died. Portland was 116 degrees. The town of Lytton, just north of Seattle, measured 121 degrees. So, and this is happening in Southern California. It's happening throughout the country, in Texas in the South. And we're having to develop a whole new disaster planning response capacity for heat waves. Where do people go for cooling centers? How do our responses, our emergency responses respond? So what are we doing about it? And who is the we? I'm going to show you all the stakeholders and all the parties that are involved in that impact this whole policy arena of climate mitigation. First, of course, we have the science that's telling us what's going on. We have 195 countries that have to do something and respond. And we have the basic source of the problem, which is the fossil fuel industries. Our use of fossil fuel is embedded in everything we do. The utilities, the generation facilities, the railroads that carry the coal, the corporate bodies, both domestically and internationally, that are dependent on a fossil fuel economy, all our aviation and marine shipping, and we talk about supply chains and transportation, all that is so far fossil fuel dependent. And then we have the financial sector that is providing the funds to make investments either towards more fossil fuel use or towards alternatives. So we have the domestic and international banks, we have the World Bank and the regional development banks, we have the insurance companies and the pensions funds, we have sovereign funds and philanthropy. Then we have our social advocacy groups, we have the media, we have our own personal actions. We have a raft of NGOs who are involved in climate in one way or another. We have political and implementation at the subnational governmental level, such as states and provinces. In the past, I've given talks about California's climate policies. And we have the United Nations that plays a role in trying to coordinate response with countries. So that's what I'm going to be talking about more now. And then I'm also going to say something about the US. So take a look at this. This is 100,000 climate marchers during the middle weekend during the Glasgow climate negotiations last December. Greta Thunberg was here and people came from all over Europe. But in their view, what the UN is doing with so many years, this was the Conference of the Parties 26. So they don't see sufficient action going on. They perceive this UN process as just blah, blah, blah. And much of it we have to agree with. So the advocates are there, they are watching, they are urging countries to take stronger, faster action. So let's look, just as a reminder, what is the UNFCCC? It's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It adopted the Paris Agreement in 2015. So I'm going to review briefly what's in the Paris Agreement. The prior global agreement, such as it was the Kyoto Protocol. And the theory there was that the UN set top-down rules that countries, I'll go through this in more detail in a moment. It was a top-down system where the UN would prescribe reporting requirements and so on. But the Paris Agreement takes the opposite approach. It rests on bottom-up pledges by countries. What I noticed, I've been to 12 of these COPs now, and what I noticed at Glasgow was that we've really reached a pivot point. So I'll go through that here. So just review of basic terminology. UNFCCC was adopted in Rio at the Earth Summit in 1992. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. These are the country delegates that meet annually. And then there's a whole series of sub-meetings through the year. Parties are countries. 197 of them have signed on to the UNFCCC. The parties send delegates to the COPs, and these are the negotiators. These are the official representatives who go behind the closed doors and do the negotiations. And then there's a whole lot of the rest of us, 30,000 others from civil society. The UN wants civil society participation in this process. So they issue credentials. You go through a process. They issue credentials. And the media is welcomed. And so we end up with literally tens of thousands of people attending the COPs now. I began in 2007. I have a credential from the Pacific Forest Trust. So the location of the COPs rotates across the 5 UN regions of the globe. And this year it was, or last year, it was Europe and Central Asia's turn. These COPs are expensive. They are huge productions. They require a tremendous commitment by the host country and the host city. Glasgow was willing to take it on, and it was chosen for last year. This coming year, it will be in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and the following one is in Saudi Arabia. So here we are in Glasgow on the Clyde River. And my problem is I can't see my slides. So what happens with this many people? Few countries have the capacity to handle that big a crowd. What they've done, we've been in soccer stadiums, we've been on an airport runway in Paris, we've been in enormous convention centers in Doha. And much of the technique now is to put up these white rubber tents. These are meeting rooms, they are auditoriums, they are small office spaces, and you end up, you can see the scale here, you end up spending a lot of energy moving from one event to another and one venue to another. So on the first day, you check in, you have all your COVID business taken care of. Every day we had to show proof of a negative COVID test in order to even get in the outer fencing. And then once you're inside, pretty good COVID restrictions. And you're together, we're all getting ready to register here on the first day. So it was pretty crowded. Lines for security, screening, so on, just to get into the venue. Every day as you approach the site, there are demonstrations, and they're great to watch. There's protests of all kinds, urging further climate action. How many COPs does it take to arrest climate chaos? Here we are on the 26th COP. How many does it take? In the corridors, it looks like a convention anywhere that you've been to, where people are trying to figure out where to go next. The schedule of events is complex, and you want to attend many things, but you get the idea here that it's a big conference. Along the way, frequently there are pop-up advocates advocating for one cause or another that's in their country that's climate related. The first day and the first 2 or 3 days are open to everyone. The closed door sessions haven't started yet. These plenary sessions we can all share in. And I enjoy going there because this is where you get all the speeches and the exhortations for we will commit and we will do more. Here they're spaced out for COVID. Usually add 6 people for every blank space you see there. Usually these are just jammed. These are the big plenary halls. They actually had 2 at Glasgow in order to spread out. The countries sit alphabetically. You can see Bulgaria and Greece and Ghana and so on. There's a secretariat for the UNFCCC, which is located in Bonn. They have major offices there. The host country selects the president for the COP. The president is selected ahead of time, so they get some years of training before it comes to your country. And then you serve afterwards to help the next COP president. So this year it was from Scotland, Alex Sharma. There's a UN executive secretary, Patricia Espinosa. Maybe some of you remember Christiana Figueres, who was who brought the Paris Agreement together. So the first day are the lots of speeches. Most of us who are observers are in the adjacent action hub, and we actually can see the events better because we're watching the closed circuit TV. So we're sitting there watching all the events up close. Boris Johnson opened the plenary session, opened the whole event. And all the dignitaries were there, Prince Charles and Camilla. David Attenborough gave an absolutely, it made you cry. His presentation of the impacts of climate change globally was very heart-wrenching. The delegates often wear their national dress on the first day, so it's quite colorful. The youth is being brought more and more into these proceedings. Look at these lovely ladies who each had excellent speeches. They're the ones who are inheriting the climate crisis, particularly in developing countries. So all the heads of state who are there get to give a speech, and they're supposed to be 3 minutes, but of course they go on much longer. Here's Spain and Indonesia and the head of the UN. So for 3 days, actually, about 118 heads of state gave speeches. Biden was there. He gave an excellent speech. Later on, John Kerry, who is our official US climate envoy, our primary negotiator, gave excellent speeches. So after about the third or fourth day, they go behind the closed doors where the observers, the rest of us, don't go. We do have some access. If asked, we can get meetings with negotiators. And many of our US environmental organizations have very good contact with our State Department negotiators. But most of the time, the rest of us observers are in what essentially is a trade show. There are 50 to 70 pavilions, each of which are sponsored by countries and by advocacy groups. And most of them have their own side session agendas. They have panels of speakers, they have workshops, they have things to watch, discussion groups to join in on. And so this is where you're looking at schedules and you're going from place to place. I particularly enjoy the market, the discussions on the development of carbon markets. That's that and the forest policy is where I've spent most of my time. But you can see peatland, science, indigenous peoples, Congo, Nordic region, people meeting and having their own scheduled discussion spaces. Here's a session on the Inuits in far northern Canada. Here's one from Indonesia. The United States had quite a large pavilion with chairs and really good audio facilities, so that because otherwise you're yelling over the noise of the adjacent booth. And so now they have this closed circuit audio, which is quite good. Almost every single cabinet secretary showed up in Glasgow in person, and then others were through Zoom meetings. And a lot of our elected Congress people came, both senators and representatives. So Jared Huffman was there, and most of the names you know about were on panels here. So what are the negotiation sessions doing? Well, for the last 25 years, certainly up until Paris, and since then, they are hammering out the text of the agreements that will be adopted by the full body. And each country and party has the ability to add in their idea of what the language should be. So they are, let me go through the issues first before I show you what bracketed text looks like. The basic issues that are under the umbrella of the negotiations. First of all, who should bear the burden of mitigating the climate crisis? Well, obviously, it's the developed countries that have caused the problem. 80% of the pollution comes from just 20 countries, but it's all the rest that are being so significantly impacted. what mechanism should drive countries to take action? Who's going to help pay for adaptation in developing countries and mitigating the impacts for countries that can't afford to do it on their own? This developing a finance mechanism has been one of the toughest negotiation issues, and it continues. It's trillions of dollars that are needed. How is that going to be shared? Who's it going to go to? Who has control over how it's going to be spent? This is a continuing issue. An underlying debate has been, what about China and India? I'll go into that in just a moment here. And ultimately, what authority does the UN have to enforce anything? And actually, the answer is very little. Mostly, this is a naming and shaming, a peer pressure, highlighting countries that are laggards, encouraging countries that are doing well. And that will continue to be a big part of the process going forward. So why has it taken so long to get an international agreement together? Well, obviously, fossil fuels are embedded throughout everything. It's extremely difficult to wean countries off when their entire economy is based on them. We don't have to, for example, Poland, they've been a coal-dependent, coal mining, coal-based economy. So transitioning them off of coal is really tough. It's also taken a lot of time because of the original structure of the Kyoto Protocol back in 1997. During Kyoto was the third COP. They adopted it in Rio in 1997, and then they had some organizational meetings. And really it was at Kyoto where the first global agreement was put together. And the theory was that they developed the countries into developed and developing countries. And it was a top-down approach with targets set by the United Nations. And the rationale, of course, was that developed countries caused the problem, so they had the burden to cut emissions. So they were given reduction targets and requirements for reporting their emissions, but the developing countries were given no obligation. They could voluntarily participate, but not. So this breaking of the globe into the green-blue being these were OECD categories of countries, but the green and blue were considered the developed countries with the obligation. The orange are the developing countries. But the problem was, from the very beginning, what about China and India? As you can see, they were categorized as developing countries. But at the time, and still now, they were developing very quickly. They posed enormous future emission sources, and it would be a competitive disadvantage for the rest of the developed world to have to take an emissions reduction burden when they didn't. So that dynamic of India and China not being included meant that the US did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol on a very large Senate vote, 95-1. Because it would, quote, result in serious harm to the economy of the United States. We've had a long history of negotiations since then. I could give talks on any one of these red stars here on what happened. There's a lot of drama associated with each one. But basically, from Kyoto to Paris, there was no grand agreement. It was mostly a stalemate. There were only small commitments that were made. And it was due to this vitriol between the developed and the developing countries. It was called the North-South divide, the evil North that causes the problem and the innocent South that's suffering from it. And this, there were amazing speeches on the floor in these plenary sessions of harsh words. You caused it. You fix it. Don't tell me how to develop. Don't tell me that I can't have carbon emissions and provide electricity to my people and growth and economic growth. You guys caused it, so you fix it. There was no trust that the developed countries would reduce their emissions, and the developed countries didn't trust the developing countries to manage money. And so it was pretty tough going. The Kyoto Protocol was set to expire in 2012, and they hoped to revise it in Copenhagen in 2009 so that countries could go back and ratify it, and it would be a seamless moving forward. But Copenhagen failed. Maybe you heard some of those stories. Obama was there, Hillary Clinton was there, the US was there in force, but they could not get a binding agreement. It was very disappointing. So Paris was the next hope. And when we got to Paris, there was huge anxiety. The city was all alerted. The Eiffel Tower was lit up every night with a different phrase on it. Here are all the parties, the family photo of the negotiators. And they got to work behind closed doors trying to come to an agreement. This is what they were doing. The agreement language was put up on a screen and in smaller meetings. And there are brackets, which are alternative language. So here you have the representative from Pakistan going through and saying, well, I want the wording to be this, and oh, it ought to be that. So all these alternatives of language were put in brackets. Hold the increase in global average temperature below 2 degrees, below 1.5, well below 2, below 1.5 or 2, as far as blah, 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 blah. And so there were 56 pages of this contested text and many choices to be made. It's like 195 authors trying to write a book together. Behind the scenes at Paris was a lot of, here you have Brazil and China, who were not supportive of a strong agreement. Saudi Arabia, of course, has vested interests. The French, as the negotiators, were trying really hard. This is where Christiana Figueres and many players were behind the scenes. The US was a great positive force in trying to get the language together for Paris. And so up until the final day of the second week, there was still no agreement. So I'm not going to go through this, but this was the blow by blow of events on the final day, the Saturday in overtime. Basically, on that day, there were still subcommittees meeting. They adjourned. New versions of text kept coming out. There were long delays. And they finally got back together around 7 o'clock. And the French president, who was leading the meeting, he starts reading something very quickly, and then he pauses. And then all of a sudden, that pause was for anybody to protest, but the pause was really short. And so suddenly he bangs the gavel and the deal was adopted. And everyone was absolutely stunned. The delegates were just amazed that finally the agreement had been agreed to. One planet, one chance to get it right, and we did it in Paris. We made history. Here, just elation, disbelief after all this time that they finally agreed. You go into this room to decide a historic agreement, the world holds its breath and counts on you. So what did Paris actually contain? The key elements, first of all, they agreed that there would be a 2 degrees temperature rise, would be the goal, with an effort towards 1.5, and this was reaffirmed in Glasgow. Then we'd call for neutrality in the second half of the century. The main piece, though, of Paris is that instead of a top-down scheme, they came up with a bottom-up approach where countries would simply make pledges to reduce emissions, and they would record those pledges in the form of what are called NDCs, nationally determined contributions. And what was different here is that all countries were in the game. There is no longer this wall between developed and developing countries. Everybody has submitted some kind of NDC, and these are to be reviewed every 5 years and ratcheted up, and they're based on transparency and so on. So finance continues to be a major issue. The mechanisms and the amounts are still being debated. and the establishment of a global carbon market mechanism with common rules, basic guidelines, was also an important part of the Paris Agreement. We can talk about markets on another time, but basically if it costs more to pollute, you do less of it. And so there is a role for pricing carbon. And so Article 6 was one of the parts that I was tracking. There were a number of other really great language in the Paris Agreement, supporting human rights and gender equality and indigenous rights and environmental rights and governance and capacity building and technical assistance. So there's a lot of supporting guidelines and themes that are within the agreement. So that was in 2015, and here Glasgow is in 2021. So what were they doing? Well, you can pass a law, but then you need to come up with the regulations to implement it. And it's similar with the Framework Convention. These intermediate COPs were writing and fleshing out different parts of the Paris Rulebook. How would these things actually work? This brings us to this December in Glasgow, and here's where we see a shift in what has been going on in the past. The main assignment at Glasgow, the part behind the closed doors, was to finish up the rule book, the very last piece that was problematic that they had to really hammer out, and they did a very good job, was to establish the guidelines for the carbon markets. But then, of course, all these other topics were covered too. What is the reporting format and how are we going to fund adaptation and so on and so on. But what really was new were a whole series of multilateral agreements between different groups of countries just on their own that was outside of the UN agenda. There was a methane pledge by 100 countries to cut methane 30% by 2030. There was a deforestation pledge, another 100 plus countries. There was an agreement between US and China, which was tough. Kerry had a tough job, but they did manage to come up with a document between themselves. One of the most exciting ones for me was this financial institutions pledge. Who is it that's financing the fossil fuel economy and who is going to finance the transition? It is the banks and the insurers and the pension funds that manage. So a group of them came together and took a pledge. They represent $130 trillion of global economy, and they have pledged to convert their portfolios towards net zero uses. There's something called the First Movers Agenda, which I'll get to shortly. And then a whole flock, you've seen these ads all over now. Many corporate entities are taking net zero carbon pledges. So the point is that the COPs are pivoting away from this negotiation of text since we've pretty much fleshed it out. And now the theme for the UNFCCC will be watching implementation and dealing with finance and urging countries forward. So this First Movers Agenda was a John Kerry initiative along with the World Economic Forum. And I'll get to that shortly. But just to finish up the Glasgow pivot, so climate action is now in the hands of countries to implement the pledges that they have made. So as you might guess, there's a web page for that. And you can log in and you can see what your country has pledged. The first NDCs are fairly general, and many of them have long laundry lists of things that they could do, particularly the developing countries, if they had the funds. So that is meant to help match up the funds that are becoming available with the needs of individual countries. Of course, the United States has its own, under the Biden administration, has its own NDC. And, but if you look at really what's happening, we have a very long way to go. The vertical axis is global greenhouse gas emissions. You can see 2030 there on the bottom axis. This is if all the NDC pledges were carried out fully, this is where we would be on the emissions curve, and this is where we need to be. So they call this the gap, and this is why we need so much more bold action going, starting now. At all levels, global, local, private sector, your personal contributions. I'm often asked, what is the best thing that we personally can do? Yes, we can try and reduce our own carbon footprint, but really voting is one of the most powerful things we can do for candidates that support a climate agenda. Okay, so now I'm going to switch scales and quickly go through some of what's happening in the United States. This particular map shows the states that have climate action plans. California is in blue because it is in the phase of updating its plan. We've had one since the 1990, well, since 2006. We've had a very ambitious plan, and now we're at the point where the scoping plan is being revised. This is something you might want to watch because we're going to be amending what we've done so far to some extent. So I think it was about a year ago, I gave an OLLI talk that was right after the Biden administration had come into office. And so I'm quickly going to review what we were thinking then. Of course, we were coming off the tails of the Trump administration where climate progress had gone backwards. One of the first things Trump did was to take us out of the Paris Agreement. And with Biden, there was this breath of fresh air and high expectations and anticipation. A new day for the climate. Biden adds swagger to climate. Climate will touch every single piece of Biden's budget. We need to be bold, taking the first steps in a major shift in climate policy, with environmental justice being included. The appointees were very exciting. They were great people, great capacity, great background. All the cabinet secretaries had climate at the top of their agenda. The first action that Biden took was to rejoin the Paris Agreement. He put out day one climate executive order, directing all executive departments to put climate at the top of their list. The web page came back that had been taken down by the prior administration. So here we are, a year in. And obviously, we all know there have been obstacles at every turn. We've not been able to get climate legislation passed. The Build Back Better Act had quite a lot of different avenues for climate mitigation. You know the fate of that. The Biden appointees have had delayed confirmations. The main action then that an administration can take is to double down on regulations, executive action, administrative agency decisions. And almost all of those have been now challenged in court, primarily having to do with what authority does the executive branch have to issue these regulations? Is there any underlying congressional authority that they've been granted to do this? This is the same Supreme Court arguments that we're hearing on many fronts. And many court decisions have gone against the current administration. I just saw that Senator Manchin came out against Sarah Bloom Raskin's appointment to the Federal Reserve Board. She has a very strong climate background, and they are delaying, certainly, we don't know her final fate, but how fossil fuel companies are stonewalling her nomination. At the this 15 years of Supreme Court climate fights came to a head Monday. Well, that Monday was the last Monday in February, so a couple weeks ago. But it's opening up this basic question of, do we even have the authority to, does EPA even have the authority to regulate greenhouse gases, which was decided 15 years ago under the court case called Massachusetts versus EPA. This was a landmark case that found, Supreme Court case that found that greenhouse gases were an air pollutant, and therefore there was authority to regulate them under the Clean Air Act. Well, this is now just in this this month case being challenged. Now it's called West Virginia versus EPA, which is asking whether or not the government can regulate carbon emissions from power plants that are existing now. There's no rule that's been proposed to do it, regulate carbon emissions. We're regulating mercury and other soot and that sort of thing. But anyway, we'll see where the Supreme Court goes with this. It could seriously jeopardize the ability of EPA and the administration to issue regulations on greenhouse gases. Of course, we can't, we all know what's happening in Ukraine, the human tragedies, but this overarching additional question on what happens with the oil and gas sector. What does a Russian oil ban mean for the clean energy transition? How are Western countries, the outcome is going to depend on how Western countries choose to shift away from Russian fossil fuels. This is going to have major implications for the climate. We can open that up for a discussion question. But basically, in the last year, coal has made a comeback because it's cheaper as oil prices go up. The development of new renewables has fallen far behind the anticipated rate of development. We're all seeing gas price increases. And what is the first thing you do? You drive less. You complain a lot, but you actually drive less, which is good for the climate. This would spur sales of electric vehicles, but we have short supply of them. And we face critical shortages of the chips and the lithium and the cobalt and the nickel and the palladium and the other minerals that we need to build these cars. The whole globe is rethinking our energy sources. Hopefully we can make it through this transition and at the end of the day, reduce our fossil fuel dependence and shifting the entire geopolitical scene. Just think of how the world geopolitical balance is structured with the oil producing countries having as much power over the rest of us as they do. And as we become more independent and all EU becomes more independent, this is going to have major political ramifications and so on. Want to fight Russian aggression? Decarbonize. So just to pull this together here, we've had some federal regulatory action. The SEC, we think, is going to adopt a rule to require disclosure of climate risks. We've had some stronger EPA emission limits, but most of the action actually is going on at the state level. I'm not going to go through each of these, but many states are looking at ways to, as you saw, have their own state climate action plans, join regional markets for greenhouse gas reduction, Transportation and Climate Initiative, the RGGI West Coast Initiative now Washington is thinking of joining the market with California. And so there is bubbling up action. I take hope from that. Let me say a few things about this First Movers Coalition. The private sector, governments are slow, and you can see the stalemate, and you can see the how hard it's been trying to get real progress, but the private sector gets it. They know there's money to be made, there's jobs to be had, there's a growth to be had in converting to a low carbon economy. And there are many technologies that are ready to go, but obviously they cost more than fossil fuels at this point. So what Carrie has done is to go to the financial sector and to the corporate sector and pull them together in what's called a First Movers Coalition, which is a platform for bridging the gap between supply and demand for emerging clean technology. The clean technology is expensive to start with, and so you need to get somebody to be the first buyer of it, to commit, to get the market going, and with eventually build the economy of scale. So they're targeting the hardest to abate sectors where it's really hard to get away from fossil fuels: aviation, steel, marine shipping, cement, trucking. And the members of this coalition have pledged to purchase green products even if they cost more. And this will prime the market for low carbon products. It's really hard to do. Where are they going to get the capital? What about their competitive advantage? It's expensive. But they do have pledges here on how they're going to approach aviation and shipping and steel and so on. 34 members were announced at Glasgow. These are names that you know. Maersk, the shipping company, Airbus, Amazon, Apple, Boeing, Nokia, United Airlines, Volvo, so on, Delta. And these are big global movers. And they are, what can I say? They are talking a great game right now. How much they can implement, who knows? And how much they can and how much they will implement, hard to say. But even if they only do half of what they're pledging, that is a lot better than where we've been so far. Bill Gates is a big proponent of that. I admire Bill Gates, no matter what you think of him. He is a real driver in putting money where we need it towards climate progress. This is one of the better books, How to Avoid Climate. It's very easy to read. It's very commonsensical. He has a global scale, and I found it very useful to read through his book. The Davos, Billionaires Convention, and the IMF and the World Economic Forum and these various forums have highlighted Carrie and so on. So you can learn a lot by listening to them and get the flavor of how they are expressing how we move forward on climate action. And I'm going to close now with the comments from Al Gore. This is from a radio podcast just a few days ago. We can't pretend it's not getting worse. We are still subsidizing fossil fuels 30 times more than renewables. But we have the solutions, but we need government policy to give the signal to the corporate sector to go forth with this. We need them to make business decisions. The market is putting a price on carbon is part of that. We don't have time for despair or time to get depressed. The market is transforming. We're rethinking everything. We're going to see bigger shifts, and we are crossing a political tipping point beyond which there will be sufficient political backbone to overcome the naysayers and the political negotiation, the political stubbornness to move forward. So I don't know if that's a hopeful note, but it is a way to bring this to a close, and now we can open it up to questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Jeff, there are some questions in the chat, but anybody else, if you would like to ask questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we can call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask your question. I'll just start with the first comment is from Julie Fulkerson. This is such an excellent, comprehensive, understandable presentation. Could it be extended to a broader audience? Thank you, Andy.
Well, sure. I'm happy to give presentations. I try to bring this. I have a lot of slides and I can adapt it to an audience. So if you have groups that you'd like to, that you think would benefit from all or part of this, I'd be happy. Just let me know.
Great. And Jane asked, could you address the local climate action plan?
No, I'm not prepared to talk about the local plan. You can look that up yourself. You can get involved. That's a subject for a different day. Yes, Humboldt is doing the best they can. The supervisors, the various cities, really transportation is a hard nut to crack in California. Well, actually globally, if you don't have coal-fired power plants, then the transportation sector is your largest emission sector. And that's why California has this tremendous, and the Biden administration as well, has a tremendous push to convert to electric vehicles. That's the only way we're going to get transportation emissions down. And I think that that's where Humboldt is looking, but that'd be a topic for another day.
The topic all by itself. The other two questions seem a little related. So what is happening with PG&E and its proposed changes, which would make household solar more expensive and thus provide a disincentive? And then the next question was asking about why is the CPUC dragging their feet on supporting home solar system?
Again, I'm not in, I know the issue, and thanks for the question. I'm not entirely up to speed on where we are now. It was before the CPUC. The argument is that people who install, well, let me back up. Schwarzenegger put a requirement for 1 million solar roofs. He wanted individual solar installations, dispersed installations. And so that has been a push, and much of the economy has been based, entrepreneurs have responded, the solar industry, to individual solar installations. The PG&E and other utilities, it's not just PG&E, but they're in California, is saying, okay, that's fine, except that somebody has to help support the grid that carries that electricity if you're selling it back to the grid. And so there should be some sort of charge or fee to help support the infrastructure to carry that electricity. And there's some merit to that, I think. Somebody has to pay for that. And if it's not the ratepayer, then is it the general ratepayer? Is it everyone who pays for the grid side of the installation, or is it just the solar homeowner who now has to pay part of that cost? And that's the political question. I think it's still at the PUC. I think the item is still pending. I don't think they've made a decision yet. But you can understand the issue there. Those with solar think that the industry will be stifled if there's now a fee attached to paying a share of the infrastructure costs. And you can read up more on that on your own.
Are there any other questions? I don't see anything else in the chat. Does anybody else have a question for Andrea today?
Well, we're just at an hour, so we covered a lot of ground, a lot of geography. I'm happy to answer further questions. This is such a broad, sprawling topic. It's hard to narrow it down. And so I tried to give you the highlights and give you the structure so that you can then, as you read each of these individual articles, you can plug the stories into this bigger framework of the institutional policy side of climate progress action.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I think you've just given us a wonderful, thought-provoking, well, future.
Well, I continue to be optimistic. I keep fighting this battle, and I just keep working on it, because
Absolutely.
one, we have to do it. I'm really motivated. And I think we can do it. And it's just pushing it. Everybody's throwing every obstacle they can against it, because the fossil fuel interests are so vested. This is a major economic global shift, geopolitically, financially, and you can see how hard it is to untangle this.
Well, we know what we can do politically in terms of how we've shut down so many. I mean, we're shunning basically Russia, and shunning is a very effective tactic. And the issue is, can we really get the banks? One of the major issues is, can we really get the banks to disinvest and not support the further development of fossil fuels? The problem with that being is, now we're in the awkward position politically of saying we'd better get off of Russia, and therefore we need to develop our own sources.
Thanks, Jane. There's also a comment from Sue and Archie Mossman about the bringing the speed limit back down to 55 nationwide to help save money and lives and reduce gas, reduce carbon emissions, and etc. So I don't see a question there, but a nice comment.
It worked during the last gas crisis, where they did do that, and in fact, miles driven went down and emissions went down. It's not really popular politically. I don't want to make the analogy to wearing masks, but it's kind of like that. You stir up a lot of hot debate, which may or may not be productive. But sure, I find myself, I mean, I have a little Nissan Leaf, my electric car, and the mileage on that is going up as my, and I'm not driving other cars, combustion cars.
There's also a comment that says, "Thank you for a great presentation. So many things I understand better now." So I also want to second that. I appreciate this. Has been a really interesting and informative presentation. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to give you these periodic updates, and I'm glad that they're helpful.
They're very helpful, and I want to personally thank you, since I convince you to do this every year. I really appreciate it, because it gives us a framework for understanding what's going on, and it's very hard to pin down in a way whether we're actually making progress or not. I mean, we're pushing the technology, but the issue is, as you said, you're optimistic, but are we anywhere near a likelihood of getting where we need to be? They say 10 years is what we have. It's not looking good at the moment. And that's what's kind of scary.
There's going to be a lot of global suffering. There's going to be a lot of damage. And that is the hard part to see. Well, it's already happening. We have a new metric of $1 billion catastrophes, events.
Yeah. Kind of like, when will enough people wake up?
Comments. There was a question that I actually missed, and Kay put it back in there again. Excellent presentation, and she just wondered about the huge cost in transporting all the people to the climate conference that you were at, and could something like Zoom have prevented some of those carbon expenses associated with travel?
It's a logical question, and it's raised every single year, and the protesters and advocates always bring that point up, and clearly bringing 40,000 people to Glasgow or to Doha or Durban, South Africa, or wherever you're going is a big expense. I don't know. One of the options that is offered to all the attendees is an option on how to offset your emissions. And they do make, the UN carries out offset programs so that it's not required, but I always opt in for that. So you can personally do that. Aviation, of course, is the big cost. There are benefits to bringing people together. This whole youth movement, the 100,000 marchers coming to Glasgow, that sends a huge signal. It shows that we as a planet are getting it. We are focusing on this. There are people that are engaged in this. And if you're just Zooming with a little small group, just like Julie's question, it's only you who sees it. And there's something to be said for face-to-face exchange of ideas. You run into people, and I mean, obviously networking, nothing new here. The benefits of conference and in person. And so sure, it's an emission source, but you have to weigh the benefits on the other side as well.
That sure does make sense. Thanks.
So Kay is asking about deforestation. That also is a topic for a whole nother presentation, both internationally and domestically. That was one of the tracks that I followed most closely during my years at the COPs. And yeah, Brazil has a higher rate of deforestation in these last 2 years than they've ever had. So it's politically driven, and it's how do you, that's where part of this market discussion comes in. How can you pay people for keeping trees standing instead of cutting them down? So it's a big, huge topic.
Ted? Unmute yourself, Ted.
I think that electrifying airplanes is a sort of losing struggle, especially long distance air flights are going to continue to consume a lot. So I believe that train travel in this country needs to be enhanced. High-speed trains can get you there almost as fast as the airplane, and they can be electrified.
I concur. I was just trying to find my slide on first movers. I didn't go into these details about what they are talking about with aviation. They're mostly, yes, electric planes are not going to go very far, maybe small little commuter between small airports. And it is one of the most intractable, but what research is going into now are what are called SAFs, Sustainable Aviation Fuels, where instead of having fossil fuel-based fuel, kerosene, you would have a bio-based algae, biomass, some plant-based fuel rather than jet fuel. I mean, it has to be jet. It would still be jet fuel. It would still be a drop-in technology. It would just be a reformulated form of fuel. So yeah, trains would be great. They're very efficient. Right now, here we are in California trying to build this bullet train to link LA and San Francisco and take a lot of traffic out of the air. and we cannot get it done. Politically, land use, local governments, cost overruns, debates over landowners not being willing to sell their property. That's the key link. We're still fighting this. The infrastructure bill that was just passed has a big chunk for the bullet train, the California cap and trade system. Half of the revenue for that is supposed to go towards the bullet train, and we can't even do that. So it's tough.
Well, again, are there any other questions? Andy, thank you so very, very much for doing this. We really appreciate, maybe I should make a date for next spring in advance, but we really do appreciate your coming and updating us, and we'll keep in touch, obviously. And I want to invite everybody back next week on March 21st. We'll be having talk about Cooperation Humboldt's concrete projects leading to transformation. And the speaker is going to be Tamara McFarland, who's president of Cooperation Humboldt, not David Cobb. So I wanted to let you all know, invite you to come up. They're doing some very interesting projects that are also, among others, economically, but climate friendly. So
Thank you.
love to have you
Thanks,
back.
Andy.
Thanks so
Thanks
much,
a lot.
Andy.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care.
You too.
Bye.